They say a woman scorned is dangerous, but I learned that a woman underestimated is absolutely unstoppable. For 16 years, I believed my husband when he said I was predictable, ordinary, the kind of wife who blended into the background of his ambitious life. I accepted his casual dismissals, his subtle put-downs, his growing distance as just the natural evolution of a long marriage. But there's a fine line between being underestimated and being completely invisible, and I was about to discover that my husband Mike had crossed that line in ways I never could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Martinez, though everyone calls me Becca, and until 3 months ago I genuinely believed I was living the life I was meant to live. Our home in Orlando's Windermere Lakes subdivision was everything we'd dreamed of when we were newlyweds. 4 bedrooms, a pristine kitchen with granite countertops, and a backyard where our twin boys Lucas and Nathan could run wild while our 14-year-old daughter Sophia practiced violin on the screened porch. From the outside, we looked like the perfect Florida family, the kind you'd see in a real estate brochure advertising the suburban dream. Mike worked as a regional sales manager for a tech equipment company, traveling frequently but bringing home the kind of steady income that allowed me to work part-time as an admissions coordinator at Valencia College. It was a comfortable arrangement that let me be present for the boys' kindergarten activities while still contributing to our family finances. We had our routines, our traditions, our comfortable predictability that I thought represented stability and success. Every morning Mike would leave for work precisely at 7:30, kissing my cheek with the same distracted affection he'd shown for years. He'd ruffle the boys' hair, remind Sophia about her orthodontist appointment or violin lesson, and drive away in his silver BMW with NPR playing softly through the speakers. I'd get the twins ready for school, make sure Sophia had everything she needed for her day, then settle into my home office to work on admissions files and answer emails from prospective students. Our evenings followed an equally established pattern. Mike would return from work somewhere between 6 and 7, depending on traffic and client meetings. We'd gather around the dining room table for dinner, discussing the boys' latest adventures in kindergarten and Sophia's progress in her advanced placement classes. Mike would help with homework when needed, though he often seemed distracted, checking his phone or mentioning some urgent work matter that required his attention after the kids went to bed. I thought this was normal. I thought this was what successful marriages looked like after 16 years and 3 children. The passionate romance of our early 20s had evolved into something more practical, more sustainable. We were partners in the business of raising a family and maintaining a household. If that made me boring in Mike's eyes, well, perhaps boring was simply another word for dependable. The first time Mike actually called me boring was during a dinner party at our neighbor's house 6 months ago. We were sitting around their patio table with 3 other couples from the neighborhood, sharing stories and laughing over wine and Carol Jenkins' famous key lime pie. The conversation had turned to bucket lists and unfulfilled dreams, the kind of nostalgic discussion that emerges when people reach their mid-30s and start questioning whether they're living the lives they'd imagined for themselves. Our neighbor Tom mentioned his desire to learn sailing, while his wife Sarah talked about wanting to take pottery classes. Another couple discussed their plan to hike the Appalachian Trail once their youngest graduated high school. When the attention turned to Mike and me, I mentioned my long-standing interest in photography, something I'd studied briefly in college, but abandoned when children and practical concerns took precedence. Mike laughed, but there was an edge to it that made me uncomfortable. "Becca's always been the practical one," he said, his tone carrying a hint of condescension I'd never noticed before. "She's not really the adventure type, more of a stay-home and organize the pantry kind of person." The table went quiet for a moment, everyone seeming to sense the subtle cruelty in his words. I forced a smile, making some self-deprecating joke about being the boring wife, but something had shifted in that moment, a tiny crack in the foundation of how I saw myself and my marriage. That comment might have been forgotten if it had been an isolated incident, but over the following months, Mike's casual dismissals became more frequent and more pointed. When I suggested we take a family vacation to the Smoky Mountains, he scoffed and said I was thinking small again. When I mentioned wanting to redecorate our master bedroom, he shrugged and said it didn't matter since we spent most of our time sleeping there anyway. When I bought a new dress for our anniversary dinner, he barely glanced up from his phone to acknowledge. The most painful moment came just 2 weeks before Mike disappeared from our lives entirely. I had surprised him by booking a weekend getaway to St. Augustine, arranging for Carol to watch the kids and making reservations at a romantic bed and breakfast I'd found online. I presented the plan excitedly, thinking he'd appreciate the spontaneity and effort. Instead, Mike looked at me with barely concealed irritation and said, "Becca, this is exactly what I mean, St. Augustine. Could you possibly choose somewhere more predictable? You've become so boring that even your surprises are boring." The words hit me like a physical blow, but what hurt more than the insult was the casual way he delivered it, as if my feelings were inconsequential and my efforts unworthy of even basic politeness. I canceled the trip and spent the weekend organizing closets, while Mike played golf with his business associates, telling myself that maybe he was right. Maybe I had become the kind of person who chose safety and familiarity over excitement and adventure. But life has a way of forcing adventure upon us whether we choose it or not, and my adventure began on a Tuesday morning in late September when I woke up to find Mike's side of the bed cold and undisturbed. This wasn't unusual in itself. Mike often rose early for conference calls with clients on the West Coast, or to get a head start on his long commute to the airport when business trips beckoned. What was unusual was the complete absence of his presence in the house. No coffee brewing in the kitchen, no shower running upstairs, no quiet sounds of morning preparation that typically accompanied his early departures. I found Sophia in the kitchen, already dressed for school and making herself toast, an expression of mild confusion on her face. "Mom, did Mike leave super early today? His car's not in the garage and he didn't make coffee." This was significant because Mike was religious about his morning coffee routine, grinding beans and brewing a perfect cup with the expensive machine he'd insisted we need. For him to leave without coffee meant either extreme urgency or unusual circumstances. I checked our shared calendar on my phone, looking for any early meetings or travel I might have forgotten. There was nothing scheduled until his regular Thursday departure for Austin, a monthly sales trip he'd been making for the past year. I called his cell phone expecting his familiar greeting and an explanation for his early departure. Instead, the call went directly to voicemail, which was odd because Mike always kept his phone charged and accessible for work purposes. As I got the twins ready for school, managing the usual chaos of finding matching socks and convincing Nathan that cereal was indeed an acceptable breakfast choice, I pushed down the small flutter of unease that had begun growing in my chest. Mike was probably dealing with some urgent client crisis, or perhaps there had been a change in his travel schedule that he'd forgotten to mention. These things happened in sales. I'd learned over the years that Mike's work often required flexibility and last-minute adjustment. After dropping the boys off at Windermere Elementary and seeing Sophia safely onto her school bus, I returned home to find a single white envelope propped against the coffee maker, my name written across the front in Mike's familiar handwriting. The envelope was thick, suggesting more than a simple note, and something about its formal placement made my hands tremble as I opened it. The letter inside was typed, printed on Mike's company letterhead, which struck me as oddly formal for a personal communication. As I began reading, my knees gave out and I sank into one of our kitchen chairs, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. "Becca," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I will be starting my new life in North Carolina. I know this will come as a shock, but I've been planning this transition for over a year, and the time has finally come to make the change I need for my happiness and fulfillment. Our marriage has run its course. We've both settled into patterns that no longer serve either of us, and I believe we'll both be happier apart. You've become comfortable with a life that feels suffocating to me, and I've reached the point where I need something completely different." The letter continued for 2 full pages, outlining Mike's decision with the same methodical approach he used for sales presentations. He mentioned his need for adventure and stimulation that our marriage couldn't provide. He wrote about feeling trapped by domestic responsibilities that prevented him from pursuing his authentic self. Most painfully, he described me as someone who had chosen mediocrity and routine over growth and excitement, as if my dedication to our family and home had been some kind of personal failing rather than a choice made out of love and commitment. Near the end of the letter, Mike provided practical information that made my blood run cold. He had cleaned out our joint savings account, taking what he called his fair share of our accumulated assets. He had left enough money to cover 1 month of household expenses, after which I would need to figure out alternative arrangements. Most shocking of all, he informed me that he had opened several credit accounts in both our names over the past 18 months, accounts that were now my responsibility to manage. The final paragraph was perhaps the cruelest part of all. Mike wrote that he had found someone who appreciated his ambition and zest for life, someone who encouraged his dreams rather than anchoring him to suburban mediocrity. He asked me not to contact him, stating that he needed a clean break to fully embrace his new beginning. He signed the letter simply Mike, without any of the endearments or expressions of affection that had once been automatic between us. I read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of calculation and betrayal. This wasn't a sudden decision born of midlife crisis or temporary unhappiness. This was a meticulously planned abandonment, executed with the same strategic thinking Mike brought to his sales campaign. While I had been living our life together, raising our children and maintaining our home, Mike had been systematically dismantling our financial security and planning his escape to what he apparently saw as a more exciting existence. The full scope of Mike's deception began revealing itself over the following hours as I made calls to banks and credit card companies, trying to understand the extent of the financial damage he had left behind. The joint savings account that should have contained nearly $40,000 held exactly $853. Our emergency fund, which I had believed contained another $15,000, had been closed entirely 3 months early. Most devastating of all, Mike had opened 6 different credit cards in both our names, running up a combined debt of $67,500 on purchases I knew nothing about. As I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by credit card statements and bank notices, trying to make sense of the financial maze Mike had created, Sophia arrived home from school. She took one look at my tear-stained face and the papers scattered across the table and immediately understood that something catastrophic had happened. "Mom, what's wrong? Where's m-" Her voice carried a tremor of fear that broke my heart, because I realized I would have to be the one to explain that the man who had helped raise her since she was 2 years old had simply decided we were no longer worth his time or commitment. The conversation with Sophia was one of the hardest things I've ever done. How do you explain to a 14-year-old that the father figure in her life has abandoned the family, not because of anything? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She did, but because he found us all boring and ordinary. How do you help a teenager understand that sometimes people choose their own happiness over their responsibilities to the people who love them? Sophia listened with the same serious expression she wore when concentrating on difficult violin pieces, asking practical questions about what this meant for our family's future and whether we would have to move away from the only home she'd ever known. What struck me most about Sophia's response was her immediate shift into problem-solving mode. Rather than falling apart or demanding answers I couldn't give, she began thinking strategically about our situation. "Mom, we need to figure out exactly what he took and what he left us with," she said with a maturity that simultaneously impressed and saddened me, "and we need to do it fast, because if he's been planning this for a year, he probably has everything arranged to make it hard for us to fight back." Her words hit me like a revelation. While I had been wallowing in shock and hurt, Sophia was already thinking like a general planning a campaign. She was right. Mike's letter and the evidence I'd found suggested careful long-term plan. This wasn't a case of a man having a breakdown and making impulsive decisions. This was calculated abandonment, executed by someone who had spent months ensuring that his escape would be as smooth as possible while leaving us to deal with the wreckage. That evening, after I had somehow managed to feed the twins and get them ready for bed despite my emotional turmoil, Sophia and I sat together in my home office, spreading out every financial document we could find and attempting to create a complete picture of our situation. What we discovered was even worse than I had initially realized. Mike hadn't just taken our savings and run up credit card debt. He had been systematically redirecting income from our small family business, Creative Solutions Marketing, into accounts I had never seen. For the past 3 years, I had been handling the creative and administrative work for our consulting business, while Mike managed what he called the financial side of operations. I trusted him completely, focusing on client relationships and project delivery while he handled invoicing, payments, and business banking. Now I realized that this division of labor had been a perfect cover for financial manipulation. Mike had been redirecting payments from our largest clients into personal accounts, leaving our business account with just enough money to cover my modest salary while siphoning off tens of thousands of dollars that should have been family income. The most painful discovery came when Sophia found a folder hidden in Mike's desk drawer containing printed emails and documents that revealed the full scope of his deception. Mike hadn't just been planning to leave, he had been building an entirely new life with someone named Amanda, a woman he had met during his business trips to Nashville. The emails, dating back 14 months, showed a relationship that had progressed from professional collaboration to personal intimacy to shared planning for their future together. In one particularly devastating email, Mike had written to Amanda about his exit strategy, describing his family as dead weight that was holding him back from his full potential. He wrote about feeling suffocated by domestic obligations and expressed excitement about starting fresh with someone who understood his ambition. Most crushingly, he described me as the kind of woman who chooses safety over everything else, someone who would never take the risks necessary for real success or happiness. Reading these emails felt like watching a movie of my own life from the perspective of someone who saw me as the villain rather than the heroine. Mike's version of our marriage bore little resemblance to the partnership I thought we had built together. In his telling, I was the boring wife who prevented him from pursuing adventure, the practical woman who prioritized stability over excitement, the person who had turned their dynamic life into something mundane and suffocating. But as the initial shock began to wear off, something else started growing in its place: anger, not just hurt or disappointment, but a cold, focused rage at the injustice of Mike's characterization of our life together. While he had been pursuing his authentic self with Amanda and planning his escape to North Carolina, I had been raising his children, managing his household, supporting his career, and building the business that had apparently funded his new life. While he saw my choices as boring and limiting, I began to see them as selfless and foundational. He could pursue adventure and risk because I had created the stable base that made such pursuits possible. More than that, I began to realize that Mike had fundamentally misjudged who I was and what I was capable of. His dismissive comments about my predictability and his assumptions about my limitations weren't accurate assessments of my character. They were convenient justifications for his betrayal. Mike needed to believe I was boring and ordinary because it made his abandonment seem reasonable rather than cruel. He needed to convince himself that I lacked ambition and courage because acknowledging my strengths would have made his actions inexcusable. As Sophia and I worked late into the night, organizing documents and creating lists of creditors and assets, I felt something awakening in me that had been dormant for years. It wasn't just determination or resilience, though both of those were part of it. It was a recognition of my own intelligence, resourcefulness, and strength that Mike's constant undermining had caused me to doubt. For 16 years, I had allowed his definition of me to become my own self-image. I had accepted his characterization of my choices as boring rather than recognizing them as strategic. I had internalized his dismissal of my practical nature, rather than valuing it as one of my greatest assets. But Mike had made a crucial miscalculation. In underestimating me so completely, he had failed to anticipate what I might be capable of when my children's security and my family's future were threatened. He had assumed I would accept his abandonment passively, perhaps struggling with the debt he'd left behind but ultimately managing to scrape by without causing him any complications in his new life. He had counted on my predictability, my tendency to choose the safe path, my reluctance to make waves or create conflict. What Mike hadn't counted on was that a boring wife could become a very dangerous adversary when properly motivated. The next morning arrived with the brutal clarity that only comes after a sleepless night spent confronting life-altering betrayal. I had dozed fitfully on the living room couch, surrounded by financial documents and Mike's cruel email, waking every hour to the fresh shock of remembering that my husband of 16 years had vanished into thin air, taking our security and leaving behind a mountain of debt that threatened to bury us all. Sophia appeared in the kitchen before dawn, already dressed for school in her usual efficient manner, but her eyes held the same hollow exhaustion I felt in my bones. She moved quietly, preparing breakfast for Lucas and Nathan without being asked, understanding instinctively that I was operating on emotional reserves that were dangerously close to empty. The twins bounced into the kitchen with their usual kindergarten energy, blissfully unaware that their world had shifted on its axis while they slept. "Where's Daddy?" Lucas asked, climbing onto his chair and scanning the kitchen as if Mike might materialize from behind the refrigerator. It was the question I had been dreading, the one that would force me to begin explaining the unexplainable to two 5-year-old boys who still believed that fathers were permanent fixtures in their lives. "Daddy had to go away for work," I managed, the lie tasting bitter in my mouth. "He'll be gone for a while, but you'll still have me and Sophia to take care of you." It was a temporary answer, a placeholder until I could figure out how to tell them the truth in terms they could understand without destroying their sense of security entirely. Nathan, always the more perceptive of the twins, studied my face with unsettling intensity. "Are you sad, Mommy? Your eyes look like when you watch those movies that make you cry." His observation was so accurate and innocent that I had to turn away, busying myself with coffee preparation to hide the fresh tears that threatened to spill over. After getting the boys off to school and watching Sophia board her bus with the same serious expression she'd worn since discovering Mike's betrayal, I returned to the kitchen table where our financial documents waited like evidence at a crime scene. The scope of Mike's deception was staggering in its methodical cruelty. This wasn't just abandonment, it was systematic destruction designed to ensure that rebuilding would be as difficult as possible. The credit cards Mike had opened in our names told a story of deliberate sabotage. The purchases weren't random or impulsive, they were strategic investments in his new life. Thousands of dollars spent on outdoor equipment, camping gear and hiking supplies that he'd apparently been storing somewhere other than our home. Hotel stays in Asheville that corresponded with his supposed business trips to Austin. Expensive dinners for two at restaurants I'd never heard of. Most painfully, jewelry purchases from a boutique in Nashville that I knew weren't for me, since I hadn't received a meaningful gift from Mike in over 2 years. Each credit card statement was a window into the double life Mike had been leading, a life where he was adventurous and spontaneous and generous, all the things he claimed I prevented him from being. While telling me we needed to be careful with our spending, while dismissing my desires for family vacations or home improvements as frivolous, Mike had been funding a completely separate existence with Amanda, creating the exciting life he claimed our marriage had denied him. The business records were even more damning. Creative Solutions marketing had been more successful than I'd realized, generating substantial income that Mike had been diverting into personal accounts for over a year. Client payments that should have gone toward our family's security had instead funded Mike's escape plan. The company I had helped build, the clients I had cultivated and served, had unknowingly financed the destruction of my family. But it was Mike's personal email account that revealed the true depth of his betrayal and the calculating nature of his departure. The correspondence with Amanda stretched back 14 months, beginning with professional collaboration on what appeared to be a legitimate business project, and evolving into something much more personal and ultimately devastating to everything I had believed about my marriage. The early emails were innocuous enough, discussions about marketing strategies and client presentations that fell within the normal scope of Mike's work. But gradually the tone shifted from professional to personal, with Mike sharing frustrations about his domestic situation, and Amanda offering sympathetic responses that encouraged him to pursue his authentic desire. By month 6, they were planning weekend getaways disguised as business trips. By month 10, they were discussing Mike's exit strategy from his current life. Reading these emails was like watching my marriage die in slow motion, seeing Mike gradually detach from our family as he invested more emotional energy in this other relationship. Amanda wasn't just Mike's girlfriend, she was his collaborator in rewriting our family's history. Together they had crafted a narrative where I was the villain holding Mike back from his true potential, where our children were burdens rather than blessings, where our home was a prison rather than a sanctuary. In one particularly painful exchange from just 2 months ago, Mike had written to Amanda about feeling trapped by Becca's small-town mentality and her inability to think beyond the suburb. He described me as someone who chose comfort over growth and who would rather organize closets than explore the world. Amanda's response was equally cutting, referring to me as the anchor around your neck,
and encouraging Mike to cut yourself free before you lose any more years to mediocrity. The cruelest part was that Mike's characterization of me wasn't entirely inaccurate. I had chosen comfort and stability, but not because I lacked ambition or courage. I had chosen these things because I believed they served our family's best interests, because I thought marriage meant making decisions based on what was good for everyone rather than just myself. I had prioritized our children's security and our home's stability because I believed these were valuable things, not limitations to be escaped. But as I read email after email, depicting me as a boring suburban wife who had somehow tricked Mike into a life he didn't want, I began to see my choices differently. My practical nature wasn't a character flaw, it was a strength that had kept our family functioning while Mike pursued his fantasies. My preference for stability wasn't evidence of small thinking, it was evidence of mature responsibility that Mike had never learned to value. More importantly, Mike's emails revealed that he fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what I was capable of. His entire escape plan was based on the assumption that I would react to his abandonment with passive acceptance, that I would struggle quietly with the debt he'd left behind without causing complications for his new life. He had counted on my predictability, my reluctance to make waves, my tendency to absorb problems rather than create them. What Mike hadn't anticipated was that discovering his betrayal would awaken aspects of my personality that had been dormant during our marriage. For 16 years I had channeled my intelligence and determination into supporting his career and maintaining our family. I had been strategic and resourceful, but always in service of goals we had supposedly shared. Now, with my children's future hanging in the balance and my own survival at stake, those same qualities were aligning behind a very different purpose. Sophia found me that afternoon hunched over my laptop in the home office, surrounded by printed emails and financial statements, working with the focused intensity of someone assembling evidence for a court case. She set down a cup of tea beside me and pulled up a chair, studying the chaos of papers with the same analytical expression she wore when approaching difficult math problems. "Mom, this looks like a crime scene investigation," she observed, her tone mixing concern with admiration. "What exactly are you trying to figure out?" Her question forced me to articulate what had been taking shape in my mind since discovering the full scope of Mike's deception. "I'm trying to understand exactly what your stepfather did, and why he thought he could get away with it," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "And I'm looking for evidence that might help us get back what he stole from our family." The word stole felt significant as I said it, transforming Mike's abandonment from a personal betrayal into something more concrete and actionable. Sophia nodded, accepting this explanation without question. "What kind of evidence are you looking for?"
Anything that proves he was deliberately hiding assets or creating debt without my knowledge. Anything that might help us trace where he took our money, or what he's planning to do with it. As I spoke, I realized I was describing the kind of investigation that required skills I wasn't sure I possessed, but that our situation desperately needed. Sophia studied the emails for several minutes, her expression growing increasingly serious as she absorbed the details of Mike's correspondence with Amanda. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts angry and determined. "Mom, he's been planning this since before Nathan and Lucas's 4th birthday. Look at this email from 13 months ago where he talks about needing to accelerate the timeline, because staying much longer would be unsustainable." She was right. The email she'd found was from early August of the previous year, written just weeks after the twins' birthday party. I remembered that party clearly. Mike had seemed distracted and irritable, claiming work stress was affecting his mood. Now I realized he had already been planning his escape, already been building his relationship with Amanda, already been viewing our family celebrations as obligations to endure rather than memories to cherish. "There's something else," Sophia continued, pulling out her phone and opening a search browser. "If Mike bought property in North Carolina like his emails suggest, there should be public records of the transaction. Property sales are public information, and if he used our joint funds for the purchase, we might have legal claims against him." Her suggestion revealed a level of strategic thinking that impressed and concerned me in equal measure. "Sophia, honey, I appreciate your help, but this isn't your responsibility," I said gently, recognizing that she was taking on adult concerns that should be mine to handle. "You're 14 years old. You should be worrying about school and friends, not tracking down your stepfather's financial crimes. Even as I said it, I knew the sentiment was unrealistic. Mike's betrayal had affected all of us, and Sophia was too intelligent and too invested in our family's welfare to remain on the sidelines. "Mom, with all due respect, that ship has sailed," she replied with a maturity that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Mike made this my problem when he decided to abandon us with massive debt and no warning. Besides, I'm good at research, and I care about what happens to our family. You don't have to protect me from reality anymore. Reality already found us. Her words hit me with unexpected force. Sophia was right. Mike's actions had thrust her into an adult world of financial crisis and family dissolution. Rather than trying to shield her from the consequences of his choices, perhaps I should be allowing her to help address them. Her analytical skills and technological fluency might actually be valuable assets in investigating Mike's deception and building our case for recovery. "Okay," I said finally, making a decision that felt both risky and necessary. "But we do this systematically, and we do it legally. No hacking, no breaking into accounts, no activities that could get us in trouble. We use publicly available information and legitimate research methods." Sophia nodded eagerly, already pulling up property search websites on her phone. Over the next several hours, we worked together with a focus and efficiency that surprised both of us. Sophia's digital native skills complemented my organizational abilities, creating a research team that was more effective than either of us would have been alone. She navigated online databases and social media platforms with ease, while I analyzed the information she uncovered and placed it in context with what we knew from Mike's emails and financial records. Our first major discovery came when Sophia found the property record for Mike's North Carolina purchase, a 43-acre mountain property in the Blue Ridge area, purchased 2 weeks earlier for $285,000. The sale had been completed through a cash transaction, meaning Mike had somehow accumulated nearly $300,000 without my knowledge. Given that our joint accounts had contained less than $60,000 total, this represented a massive hidden accumulation of wealth. "Mom, look at this," Sophia said, her voice tight with anger as she pulled up the property listing photos on her laptop screen. The images showed a beautifully renovated log cabin with expansive mountain views, a wraparound porch, and modern amenities throughout. It was exactly the kind of place Mike had sometimes mentioned wanting to retire to someday, the kind of dream property that required substantial financial resources to acquire. "He bought his dream house with our money," I murmured, studying the photos with a mixture of admiration and rage. The property was stunning. Exactly the kind of place any reasonable person would want to own, but Mike had purchased it with funds that should have secured our children's education and our family's future, transforming a shared dream into a personal theft. The listing agent's information was still available online, providing us with a potential source of information about the transaction. More importantly, the property purchase had occurred just 2 weeks ago, meaning Mike was probably still in the area completing the transition to his new life. He wasn't hiding on some remote island or foreign country. He was less than 4 hours away, setting up house with Amanda in the mountains of North Carolina. Our second major discovery came through Sophia's investigation of Mike's social media activity. While his main Facebook and LinkedIn accounts had been dormant for months, she found a newer Instagram account under a slightly different name that told the story of his double life. Photos from hiking trips, restaurant dinners, and weekend getaways that I had believed were business-related were revealed to be romantic adventures with Amanda. The account even included pictures from inside what was clearly the North Carolina property, showing Mike and Amanda toasting with champagne in the kitchen of their new home. "He's not even trying to hide it," Sophia said with disgust, scrolling through images that documented Mike's new life in real time. "Look, here's a post from yesterday showing him and Amanda hiking some trail in Asheville. The caption says, 'Finally free to live authentically.' I want to throw my phone at the wall." The Instagram account was a goldmine of information about Mike's activities and whereabouts, but it was also a catalog of betrayal that cut deeper with every image. Mike looked genuinely happy in these photos, relaxed and energetic in ways I hadn't seen in years. He was hiking, camping, exploring art galleries, trying new restaurants, living exactly the kind of adventurous life he claimed our marriage had prevented him from pursuing. But looking at these images also revealed something Mike probably hadn't intended to show: evidence of the systematic planning behind his escape. The hiking gear appeared in photos dating back 8 months. The restaurants were consistently in the Asheville area, suggesting regular visits over an extended period. Most tellingly, several photos showed Mike wearing expensive outdoor clothing and equipment that I had never seen, items that must have been purchased with the credit cards he'd hidden from me. "Sophia, you're brilliant," I said, my voice filled with genuine admiration as I realized the significance of what she'd uncovered. "This Instagram account is basically a confession. Every photo shows him using assets that should belong to our family, living a lifestyle funded by money he took from our accounts. If we ever need to prove systematic planning and deliberate theft, this is perfect evidence." Our third major discovery came through what Sophia called digital archaeology, tracing Mike's online activities through various platforms and cross-referencing them with his financial record. She found that Mike had been using a separate email address for his North Carolina activities, an address that appeared in online hiking forums, local business directories, and even voter registration records, showing his change of address from Florida to North Carolina. "Mom, I think I found something really important," Sophia said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had just solved a complicated puzzle. "Mike registered to vote in North Carolina 3 weeks ago, which means he's established legal residency there. But look at this. According to Florida law, if he's changed his legal residence without properly dividing marital assets, you have strong grounds for challenging the property purchase and demanding your share of joint assets." I stared at her, amazed once again by her analytical capabilities and her instinct for finding legally relevant information. "How do you know about Florida marital property law?" I asked, genuinely curious about where a 14-year-old had acquired knowledge of divorce proceedings and asset division. Sophia shrugged, slightly embarrassed. "I've been researching it since we found Mike's letter. I figured if he abandoned us, you'd probably need to file for divorce, and I wanted to understand what our rights were. It turns out that Florida is an equitable distribution state, which means marital property should be divided fairly even if one spouse tries to hide assets." Her research had uncovered information that would have taken me weeks to discover on my own, information that could be crucial to protecting our family's financial interests. Mike's assumption that I would passively accept his abandonment was proving to be a serious miscalculation. Instead of the helpless suburban wife he expected, he was dealing with a motivated mother backed by a strategically minded teenager who refused to accept injustice. As evening approached and the twins returned from their after-school program at Carol's house, Sophia and I had assembled a comprehensive picture of Mike's deception and his current situation. We knew where he was living, how much he had spent on his new property, what assets he had hidden, and even what he was doing with his time. More importantly, we had documented evidence of his systematic planning and deliberate theft that could potentially be used to demand accountability and restitution. "So what's our next step?" Sophia asked as we organized our research into neat folders and digital files. Her use of the word "our" wasn't lost on me. This had become a joint mission, a family project that transcended normal parent-child boundaries. While part of me still wanted to protect her from adult responsibilities, I couldn't deny that her contributions had been invaluable and that our teamwork had produced results neither of us could have achieved alone. "Our next step is to consult with a lawyer," I replied, feeling more confident and purposeful than I had since discovering Mike's betrayal. "We need professional advice about our legal options and how to protect our rights. But first, we need to make sure the boys are okay and that our immediate needs are covered." The practical concerns of daily life hadn't disappeared just because we had uncovered Mike's crimes. Lucas and Nathan still needed dinner and bedtime stories and the security of routine even as their world shifted around them. That night, after the twins were safely asleep and Sophia had reluctantly agreed to focus on homework instead of further investigation, I sat alone in my home office reviewing everything we had discovered. The evidence was overwhelming. Mike had systematically planned his abandonment for over a year, stolen significant assets from our joint accounts, and established a new life in North Carolina with his girlfriend Amanda. He had counted on my passivity and ignorance to ensure his escape went unchallenged. But Mike had made several critical errors in his planning. He had underestimated my intelligence and determination. He had failed to anticipate Sophia's analytical skills and technological savvy. Most importantly, he had left a digital trail of evidence that documented his crimes in extraordinary detail. His Instagram account alone was enough to prove deliberate planning and asset concealment that would be difficult to defend in any legal proceeding. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine excitement about the future. Not because our situation had improved, we still faced massive debt and an uncertain financial future, but because I had rediscovered my own capabilities and strength. Mike's betrayal had awakened parts of my personality that marriage and motherhood had subdued, but not eliminated. I was still the intelligent, determined woman who had built a successful business and managed a complex household. I had simply forgotten that these skills could be deployed in service of justice rather than just domestic harmony. Mike thought he was dealing with a boring suburban wife who would quietly absorb his abandonment and struggle along with the debt he'd left behind. What he was actually dealing with was an angry mother with excellent organizational skills, a brilliant teenage daughter with digital investigation abilities, and a growing understanding of exactly how much damage his betrayal had caused. He had counted on my predictability, but predictability was about to become his worst nightmare. The boring wife he had dismissed and abandoned was about to become everything he never expected: strategic, relentless, and absolutely committed to ensuring that his crimes had consequences. Mike wanted adventure and excitement in his new life. He was about to get more of both than he had bargained for, though not in the way he had anticipated. The mountain retreat he thought would be his sanctuary was about to become the place where his past caught up with him in ways he had never imagined possible. Tomorrow the real work would begin. The first credit card payment was due on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Mike's disappearance. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the notice demanding $437 for an account I had never opened, for purchases I had never made, for a debt that existed solely because my husband had forged my signature and stolen my identity. The minimum payment alone was more than my weekly grocery budget, and this was just one of 6 fraudulent accounts now demanding money I simply didn't have. My part-time position at Valencia College paid $18 an hour for 25 hours per week, barely enough to cover our basic expenses even when Mike's income had supplemented our household budget. Now facing $67,000 in debt while trying to maintain our home and care for 3 children on my salary alone, the mathematics of survival seemed impossible. Every calculation I attempted led to the same conclusion: we were drowning financially and I had no obvious way to reach the surface. The mortgage payment had been due a week earlier, and despite my calls to the bank requesting forbearance, they had made it clear that missing a second payment would trigger foreclosure proceedings. The house that had been our sanctuary, our symbol of family stability and success, was about to become another casualty of Mike's betrayal. The twins' preschool had already sent a notice about overdue tuition, and I knew that losing their childcare would make it impossible for me to work even the limited hours that provided our only current income. Sophia found me that morning hunched over a calculator and a stack of bills, trying unsuccessfully to make our resources stretch to cover our obligation. She had been getting herself and the twins ready for school without complaint, taking on responsibilities that should have been mine while I struggled to find solutions to problems that seemed to multiply faster than I could address them. Her quiet efficiency and maturity were both a blessing and a source of additional guilt. At 14, she shouldn't have been worried about whether we could afford groceries or whether her brothers would lose their preschool. "Mom, you haven't eaten anything today," she observed, setting a cup of coffee and a piece of toast beside my pile of financial documents. "And you look like you haven't slept in a week." Her concern was evident in her voice, but there was also a note of fear that she was trying to. Sophia was old enough to understand that our situation was dire, and watching me struggle with problems I couldn't solve was clearly affecting her more than she wanted to admit. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I lied, forcing a smile that felt foreign on my face. "Just trying to work out some budget issues. Nothing for you to worry about." Even as I said the words, I knew they were unconvincing. Sophia had been involved in uncovering Mike's crimes. She understood the scope of our financial crisis better than most adults would.
pretending that everything was manageable when clearly it wasn't, served no purpose except to maintain an illusion of parental competence that was rapidly crumbling. After the children left for school, I called the credit card companies to attempt negotiations for payment plans or hardship arrangement. Each conversation followed the same frustrating pattern: expressions of sympathy for my situation followed by inflexible demands for immediate payment or aggressive collection procedure. The customer service representatives acknowledged that I was a victim of fraud, but they also made it clear that proving fraud would be a lengthy legal process that wouldn't stop interest charges or late fees from accumulating in the meantime. "Mrs. Martinez, I understand your husband forged your signature," said the representative from one particularly aggressive collection agency, "but from our perspective, you're jointly liable for this debt regardless of how it was incurred. If you can provide a police report documenting fraud, we can begin an investigation, but that process typically takes 60 to 90 days. In the meantime, we need to arrange payment to avoid further damage to your credit score." The police report requirement had become a recurring theme in my conversations with creditors, but filing such a report felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Officially reporting Mike for fraud would transform our marital breakdown from a private family crisis into a criminal matter with unpredictable consequences. Part of me still hoped that Mike might somehow come to his senses and take responsibility for the financial damage he had caused, making criminal charges unnecessary. But as the collection calls became more frequent and more threatening, as the foreclosure timeline grew shorter and our resources dwindled, I began to realize that my reluctance to take decisive legal action was actually enabling Mike's escape from accountability. He was counting on my emotional attachment to our marriage, my desire to protect our family's privacy, and my natural inclination toward conflict avoidance to shield him from the consequences of his crime. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon when I picked up the twins from Carol's house, where they had been staying after school since their preschool had suspended their enrollment due to non-payment. Carol greeted me at the door with the patient kindness she had shown throughout our crisis, but I could see the concern in her eyes as she took in my appearance. I hadn't been sleeping well, hadn't been eating regularly, and was showing the physical effects of stress that no amount of concealer could hide. "Becca, honey, you look exhausted," Carol said gently, ushering me into her living room while the twins played with her collection of vintage toys. "I know you're trying to handle everything on your own, but maybe it's time to accept some help. Have you thought about reaching out to family or applying for assistance programs?" Her suggestion was well-intentioned, but it highlighted the isolation that Mike's abandonment had created. My parents lived in Michigan and were dealing with their own health issues. Asking them for financial support would only add to their stress without significantly improving our situation. Mike's family had always been distant, and his betrayal had effectively severed any remaining connections there. The assistance programs I had researched required documentation and processing time that we simply didn't have while facing immediate foreclosure and mounting debt. "I appreciate the offer, Carol, but I need to figure this out myself," I replied, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity while my world collapsed around me. "Mike created this mess and somehow I'll find a way to fix it." Even as I spoke the words, I knew they were more hopeful than realistic. Mike had systematically destroyed our financial stability over more than a year. Expecting to repair that damage in a matter of weeks with my limited resources was essentially magical thinking. Carol studied my face with the shrewd assessment of someone who had spent decades working with troubled students and struggling families. "Becca, there's a difference between independence and stubbornness," she said quietly. "Right now, your children need you to be practical, not proud. If that means filing police reports or accepting help or making difficult legal decisions, then that's what you need to do." Her words hit me like cold water, forcing me to confront the reality that my reluctance to take aggressive action against Mike was actually harming my children. Lucas and Nathan deserved stability and security, not a mother so overwhelmed by financial crisis that she couldn't provide basic necessities. Sophia deserved to focus on her education and social development, not worry about whether her family would have a place to live next month. That evening, after the twins were in bed and Sophia was working on homework, I sat alone in my home office trying to face the mathematical certainty of our situation. Even if I managed to negotiate payment plans for all the fraudulent credit cards, even if I secured forbearance on the mortgage, even if I found a full-time job with higher pay, we were still looking at years of financial struggle that would affect every aspect of my children's lives. The college savings accounts Mike had emptied couldn't be quickly replaced. The retirement funds he had diverted would take decades to rebuild. The damage to my credit score would affect our ability to rent housing, secure loans, or even get utility services without substantial deposits. But the real breaking point came when Nathan developed a fever that spiked to 103 degrees, requiring an emergency room visit that I knew we couldn't afford. Sitting in the waiting area of Orlando Regional Medical Center at 2 in the morning, holding my sick child while Sophia watched Lucas in the uncomfortable plastic chairs nearby, I felt the full weight of my helplessness crash down upon me. The medical staff was professional and compassionate, treating Nathan's fever and determining that he had a severe case of strep throat that required antibiotics. But when the billing department asked for my insurance card, I discovered that Mike had canceled our family health coverage 2 weeks before his departure, another detail he had neglected to mention in his goodbye letter. The emergency room visit alone would cost over $3,000, money I absolutely did not have and could not borrow. "Mom, what are we going to do?" Sophia asked as we drove home at dawn, Nathan finally sleeping peacefully in his car seat after receiving medication. Her question carried the weight of someone who understood that this latest crisis wasn't just about medical bills, but about our family's complete vulnerability to circumstances beyond our control. "I don't know, baby," I admitted, too exhausted and overwhelmed to maintain any pretense of having everything under control. "I honestly don't know." It was the first time I had acknowledged out loud that our situation might be beyond my ability to manage, that Mike's betrayal had created problems that required more resources and expertise than I possessed. The weekend that followed was the darkest period of my life since my first husband's death, 12 years earlier. The medical bills arrived by email on Saturday morning, followed by increasingly urgent notices from creditors who were no longer willing to accept my promises of future payment. The mortgage company called to inform me that foreclosure proceedings would begin the following week if the overdue payments weren't received immediately. Most devastating of all, the twins' preschool director called to explain that they couldn't continue holding Lucas and Nathan's spots without current tuition payment. I found myself unable to get out of bed on Sunday morning, paralyzed by the magnitude of problems I couldn't solve and responsibilities I couldn't meet. Sophia took charge of the household with frightening competence, preparing breakfast for her brothers, managing their activities, and fielding phone calls from creditors with a maturity that broke my heart. At 14, she was essentially functioning as a single parent while I wallowed in despair and self-pity. The lowest moment came when Lucas asked why I was crying while we watched cartoons together on Sunday afternoon. His innocent concern, combined with Nathan's sleepy snuggles as he recovered from his illness, forced me to confront the reality that my children were watching their mother fall apart under pressure. They needed me to be strong, to be resourceful, to find solutions, rather than surrender to circumstances. My emotional breakdown might be understandable, but it wasn't helping anyone and was actively making their situation worse. "Mommy's just worried about some grown-up stuff," I told Lucas, wiping my tears and forcing myself to sit up straighter. "But we're going to figure it out together, okay? Sometimes mommies need to be sad for a little while before they can be brave again." His solemn nod and Nathan's whispered, "I love you, Mommy," reminded me that I wasn't just responsible for managing our crisis, I was responsible for modeling resilience and determination for children who would remember how their mother handled this challenge for the rest of their lives. That Sunday evening, after the twins were asleep, Sophia knocked on my bedroom door and entered without waiting for permission. She sat on the edge of my bed, with the same serious expression she had worn since Mike's disappearance, clearly preparing to have a conversation that would be difficult for both of us. "Mom, I've been thinking about our situation," she began, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was about to say, "and I think you need to stop protecting Mike and start protecting us." Her directness caught me off guard, forcing me to confront the uncomfortable truth that my reluctance to take aggressive legal action was indeed a form of protecting the man who had betrayed us all. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew what she was going to say. "I mean, you need to file police reports about the fraud. You need to hire a lawyer to go after Mike's hidden assets. And you need to stop worrying about whether he faces consequences for what he did to our family, she replied with a clarity that was both impressive and heartbreaking. Mike didn't worry about protecting us when he stole our money and abandoned us with massive debt. Why are you still trying to protect him? Her question highlighted the fundamental flaw in my approach to our crisis. While I had been focusing on damage control and survival, trying to minimize the disruption to our lives and avoid escalating our conflict with Mike, I hadn't been thinking strategically about justice or accountability. Mike's crimes had left us in desperate circumstances, but those same crimes also provided legal remedies that I had been too emotionally exhausted or ethically conflicted to pursue. I don't want you boys to grow up knowing their father is a criminal, I said quietly, voicing the concern that had been holding me back from filing fraud charges. I don't want that to be part of their story or their identity. It was a legitimate worry, but one that assumed Mike's criminal behavior was somehow my responsibility to conceal rather than his responsibility to answer for. Sophia considered this for a moment, then shook her head firmly.
My reluctance to pursue aggressive legal action against Mike wasn't noble or protective. It was enabling him to escape accountability while my children suffered the consequences of his crimes. He had calculated that I would be too overwhelmed, too proud, or too conflicted to fight back effectively, and so far his calculation had been correct. But Mike had made a critical error in his assessment of my character and capabilities. He had assumed that the boring suburban wife he had dismissed and abandoned would remain passive and compliant even when her children's welfare was threatened. He had counted on my tendency toward conflict avoidance and my desire to maintain family stability, not recognizing that these same qualities could become fierce determination when the stakes were high enough. As Monday morning arrived with its familiar chaos of getting children ready for school and facing another day of impossible financial pressures, I felt something shift inside me. The crushing despair that had paralyzed me over the weekend was gradually being replaced by a cold, focused anger that clarified my thinking and sharpened my resolve. Mike wanted to abandon his family and start a new life with his girlfriend. Fine, but he was going to do it while facing the full legal consequences of his crimes, and he was going to do it while providing proper financial support for the children he had left behind. The boring wife he had underestimated was about to become his worst nightmare, a motivated mother with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Mike thought he had planned the perfect escape, but he had forgotten that the most dangerous adversary is someone who has been pushed too far and finally decides to push back. His mountain retreat in North Carolina was about to become a lot less peaceful than he had anticipated, and his new life with Amanda was about to become complicated by the past he thought he had left behind. It was time to stop being a victim and start being a force for justice. Mike had awakened something in me that marriage and motherhood had kept dormant, but not destroyed. The fierce determination of a woman who refused to let anyone harm her children without facing serious consequences. He wanted excitement and adventure in his new life. I was about to give him more of both than he could handle, though not in the way he had expected. The transformation was complete. The woman who had absorbed years of casual cruelty and dismissive comments had finally reached her breaking point. Mike was about to discover that boring wives who have been pushed too far can become absolutely terrifying adversaries when they decide to fight back with everything they have. Monday morning brought an unexpected phone call that would change everything. I was sitting at my kitchen table, finally prepared to file the police report that would officially label Mike's actions as criminal fraud, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to Jennifer Walsh, a family law attorney whose name Sophia had found during her research into legal options for abandoned spouses. "Miss Martinez, I hope you don't mind me calling directly," Jennifer began, her voice carrying the confident professionalism that comes from years of handling complex family cases. "Your neighbor Carol Jenkins reached out to me about your situation. She's a former colleague of mine from when I worked at Legal Aid, and she thought I might be able to help you navigate some of the challenges you're facing." I felt a surge of gratitude toward Carol, whose quiet intervention had provided exactly the kind of professional support I needed, but couldn't afford. Jennifer explained that she specialized in cases involving financial abandonment and marital fraud, representing clients who discovered that their spouses had been systematically hiding assets or accumulating debt, without their knowledge. More importantly, she offered to review my case on a contingency basis, meaning I wouldn't owe legal fees unless we successfully recovered assets from Mike. Carol gave me a general overview of your husband's abandonment and the debt he left behind, Jennifer continued, but I'd like to meet with you and review the evidence you've gathered. From what she described, this sounds like a case where we might be able to secure significant financial recovery, especially if your husband used marital assets to purchase property without your consent. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, giving me just enough time to organize all the documentation Sophia and I had compiled over the past 3 weeks. I printed out Mike's emails documenting his relationship with Amanda and his plans for escape, gathered the credit card statements showing fraudulent charges, and prepared copies of the property records showing his North Carolina purchase. By the time I arrived at Jennifer's downtown Orlando office, I had assembled what amounted to a comprehensive case file demonstrating Mike's systematic betrayal and financial crime. Jennifer's office was located in a sleek, high-rise building that normally would have intimidated me, but my desperation had burned away most of my capacity for social anxiety. I was ushered into a conference room where Jennifer waited with a legal pad and a reassuring smile that immediately put me at ease. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her late 30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that radiated confidence without arrogance. Miss Martinez, before we discuss your specific situation, I want you to understand something important, Jennifer began, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who genuinely cared about her client's welfare. What your husband did to you isn't just morally wrong, it's legally actionable in multiple ways: financial abandonment, identity theft, fraudulent transfer of marital assets, and concealment of income, all provide grounds for both civil recovery and criminal prosecution. As I spread out the evidence across Jennifer's conference table, I watched her expression shift from professional interest to genuine amazement. Mike's emails alone were more comprehensive than most attorneys see in similar cases, providing a detailed timeline of his planning and clear evidence of his intent to defraud our family. The property purchase documentation showed a flagrant violation of Florida's marital property laws, since Mike had used joint funds to acquire real estate without my knowledge or consent. Ms. Martinez, this is extraordinary documentation, Jennifer said, studying Mike's Instagram account on her laptop screen. Most clients in your situation struggle to prove systematic planning or deliberate concealment. Your husband essentially documented his own crimes and posted them on social media. I've never seen a case where the evidence was this comprehensive or this damaging to the opposing party, but the real breakthrough came when Jennifer made a series of phone calls to colleagues in North Carolina, investigating the legal status of Mike's property purchase. What she discovered transformed our situation from desperate damage control to strategic opportunity. North Carolina law required both spouses to consent to major asset purchases when significant marital funds were involved, and Mike's failure to obtain my signature on the property transfer documents made the entire transaction potentially voidable. Rebecca, I have extraordinary news, Jennifer announced after completing her calls. The property your husband purchased in North Carolina was acquired using what North Carolina courts would recognize as marital assets, without your knowledge or consent. Under both Florida and North Carolina law, you have grounds to challenge that purchase and potentially force the sale of the property with proceeds divided according to marital property rights. The implications were staggering. Instead of being stuck with massive debt while Mike enjoyed his mountain retreat, we could potentially force him to sell the property and return a significant portion of the proceeds to our family. The North Carolina property was worth $285,000, meaning that even after legal fees and transaction costs, we could recover enough money to pay off the fraudulent credit cards and stabilize our financial situation. But there's more, Jennifer continued, her excitement growing as she outlined our legal options. Your husband's systematic planning and deliberate concealment of assets could make him liable for additional damages beyond simple asset recovery. Florida law allows for punitive measures when one spouse deliberately attempts to defraud the other, including awards of attorney's fees and compensation for emotional distress. Jennifer explained that she would need to act quickly to freeze Mike's assets and prevent him from further dissipating marital funds, but the evidence we had gathered provided more than enough justification for emergency court order. Mike's own communications would serve as proof of his fraudulent intent, making it difficult for him to claim that his actions were anything other than deliberate theft. "What I need from you now is authorization to proceed aggressively," Jennifer said, pulling out a retainer agreement and client authorization form. "We're going to file for emergency asset preservation, challenge the North Carolina property purchase, and pursue both civil recovery and criminal prosecution. Your husband clearly believed he could abandon his family without consequences, but he was wrong about Florida law and he was wrong about your willingness to fight back." As I signed the legal documents that would officially declare war on Mike's attempt to escape accountability, I felt a surge of power and purpose that had been absent from my life since his abandonment. For 3 weeks, I had been reacting to crises Mike had created, struggling to survive financially while he enjoyed his new life with Amanda. Now finally, I was taking aggressive action to protect my children's interests and ensure that Mike faced real consequences for his crime. The transformation in our situation was almost immediate. Jennifer filed emergency motions that afternoon, using Mike's own emails and social media posts as evidence of his fraudulent conduct and flight risk. By Wednesday, a Florida judge had issued orders freezing Mike's remaining assets and requiring him to appear in court within 30 days to explain his financial conduct during our marriage. More importantly, Jennifer had contacted authorities in North Carolina to challenge the property purchase and potentially force Mike to defend his acquisition of what were arguably stolen assets. But the real satisfaction came when Jennifer called on Thursday morning with news that Mike had been served with legal papers at his North Carolina property. According to the process server, Mike had been visibly shaken by the documents and had immediately called an attorney, clearly realizing that his carefully planned escape was about to become a legal nightmare. "Rebecca, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen someone's face change the way your husband's did when he realized he was being sued," Jennifer reported with obvious satisfaction. "He went from confident homeowner to panicked defendant in about 30 seconds. Apparently, he kept asking the process server if there had been some mistake, as if he couldn't believe his abandoned wife had actually fought back." The psychological impact on Mike was immediately evident in a series of increasingly desperate phone calls to our house, calls that Jennifer had advised me to record as evidence of his emotional state and potential admissions of wrongdoing. In the first call, Mike was angry and accusatory, demanding to know why I was trying to destroy his new life and insisting that I was being vindictive and unreasonable. His tone suggested that he genuinely believed I should have accepted his abandonment gracefully and allowed him to enjoy the proceeds of his financial crimes without interference. "Becca, this is insane," Mike said during his second call, his voice carrying a note of desperation that I had never heard before. "I left you enough money to get by for a month. I never intended for you to struggle this much. Can't we work something out without involving lawyers and court?" His offer to work something out was particularly galling, since he had shown no interest in our family's welfare when planning his escape, but suddenly wanted to negotiate now that his own comfort was threatened. "Mike, you stole over $60,000 in credit card debt that I have to pay, emptied our savings accounts, canceled our health insurance, and bought yourself a mountain retreat with money that belonged to our children," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "Working something out would have meant taking responsibility for your actions before abandoning your family, not offering to negotiate after you've been caught." It felt empowering to speak to him with complete honesty for the first time in years, without the accommodating tone I had always used to avoid conflict. The third call revealed just how thoroughly Mike had miscalculated my character and capability. His voice was shaky with what sounded like genuine fear, as he realized that his legal situation was becoming increasingly serious. "Becca, you don't understand what you're doing," he pleaded, abandoning his earlier anger for pure desperation. "If you push this too far, I could lose everything. Amanda and I could lose the house. I could face criminal charges. My career could be destroyed. Is that really what you want? Is revenge more important to you than moving on with your life?" His framing of my pursuit of justice as revenge revealed how fundamentally he misunderstood the situation. This wasn't about hurting Mike for personal satisfaction. It was about protecting my children's financial future and ensuring that his crimes had meaningful consequences. Mike wanted to characterize my legal action as vindictive, rather than acknowledging that he had created this situation through his own criminal behavior. "Mike, this isn't revenge," I replied with a calmness that surprised even me. "This is accountability. You committed fraud, identity theft, and financial abandonment. The consequences you're facing are the natural result of choices you made, not punishments I'm imposing on you." His silence on the other end of the line suggested that he was finally beginning to understand that the boring suburban wife he had dismissed was capable of strategic thinking that matched or exceeded his own. The breakthrough came during Jennifer's negotiations with Mike's hastily retained North Carolina attorney. Faced with overwhelming evidence of financial fraud and the real possibility of criminal prosecution, Mike's legal team advised him to accept a settlement, rather than risk a trial that would almost certainly result in complete financial ruin and potential jail time. The settlement terms were more favorable than I had dared to hope. Mike would be required to sell the North Carolina property immediately, with 60% of the proceeds going to our family to compensate for his theft of marital assets. He would assume full responsibility for all the fraudulent credit card debt, removing my name from the accounts and protecting my credit score from further damage. Most importantly, he would be required to pay substantial child support for Lucas and Nathan, with provisions for college funding and medical expenses that would ensure their long-term security. "Rebecca, your husband's attorney called this morning to accept our settlement offer," Jennifer announced during a call that felt like winning the lottery. "Mike realizes that fighting this case would likely result in criminal charges and complete financial destruction. So he's agreed to our terms rather than risk going to trial. You've essentially recovered everything he stole plus compensation for the damage he caused to your family." But the real victory wasn't financial, it was personal. Mike had abandoned us believing that I was too weak, too boring, too predictable to fight back effectively. He had counted on my tendency to avoid conflict and my desire to protect our family's privacy to shield him from accountability. Instead, he had discovered that underestimating a motivated mother was a catastrophic strategic error. The final conversation with Mike came when he called to inform me that he was complying with the settlement terms and would be transferring the required funds within 48 hours. His tone was defeated and bitter, but there was also something that might have been grudging respect. "I never thought you had it in you, Becca," he admitted quietly. "I thought you were too soft, too afraid of conflict, to really fight back. I guess I was wrong about a lot of things." His acknowledgement felt like validation of everything I had discovered about myself during this crisis. That my practical nature masked strategic intelligence. That my preference for stability reflected strength rather than weakness. That my commitment to family made me formidable rather than boring. "You were wrong about who I am and what I'm capable of," I agreed, "but more than that, you were wrong about what really matters. You thought adventure and excitement were more important than responsibility and love. You thought a new relationship was more valuable than the family you already had. Those weren't mistakes about me, Mike. They were mistakes about what makes life meaningful." 6 months later, our lives had stabilized in ways I hadn't thought possible during those dark weeks after Mike's abandonment. The settlement money had eliminated our debt, secured our house, and provided a foundation for rebuilding our financial future. More importantly, the experience had transformed my understanding of my own capabilities and strength. Sophia, who had been instrumental in uncovering Mike's crimes and supporting our legal case, had decided to pursue law with the same determination she had shown during our crisis. "I want to help other families like ours," she explained when filling out college application essays. "I want to make sure that people who try to abandon their responsibilities face real consequences." Her experience with our situation had given her a sense of purpose and a career direction that utilized her analytical skills and moral convictions. The twins, now in first grade, had adapted to our new normal with the resilience that children often display when faced with major change. They occasionally asked about their father, but without the desperate longing that had characterized their questions immediately after his departure. Our family had reconfigured itself around the three of us, creating new traditions and routines that felt authentic and sustainable. As for me,
I had discovered that being called boring by someone who valued selfishness over responsibility was actually a compliment. My practical nature, my commitment to stability, my preference for building rather than destroying, had proven to be exactly the qualities needed to protect my family and pursue justice when it mattered most. Mike had mistaken depth for dullness, strength for submission, strategic thinking for simple-mindedness. The mountain retreat in North Carolina had been sold, just as the settlement required. According to Jennifer, Mike and Amanda had relocated to a much smaller property that reflected their reduced financial circumstances. Mike's career had survived the legal proceedings, but his reputation in the industry had been damaged by the fraud allegation. Most importantly, he was now legally obligated to support his children financially, regardless of his personal feelings about his former family. The final piece of vindication came in an unexpected form: a letter from Amanda, delivered through Jennifer's office to avoid direct contact. In it, she revealed that Mike's pattern of financial deception hadn't been limited to his marriage to me. During their relationship, he had been misrepresenting his income, exaggerating his assets, and making financial commitments he couldn't keep. The mountain retreat purchase had created debt obligations that Mike had concealed from her, just as he had concealed his credit card fraud from me. I realize now that Mike's version of events wasn't accurate, Amanda wrote in her letter. He portrayed you as someone who was holding him back from success and happiness, but I'm beginning to understand that you were actually the responsible party who kept your family functioning while he pursued fantasies he couldn't afford. I thought I was helping him escape a boring marriage, but I was actually helping him abandon his responsibilities to people who deserved better. Her letter served as final confirmation that Mike's characterization of our marriage had been self-serving fiction, designed to justify his betrayal. The boring suburban wife he had described to Amanda bore no resemblance to the strategic, determined woman who had tracked him down, exposed his crimes, and forced him to face consequences for his actions. Today, when people ask me about that period in my life, I tell them that being abandoned by someone who found me boring was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, to develop skills I had never needed before, and to understand that my values and priorities were actually assets rather than limitations. Mike wanted excitement and adventure in his life, and he certainly got both, though not in the way he had anticipated. The boring wife he had underestimated became his most formidable adversary, proving that predictability could be a weapon when wielded by someone who refused to accept injustice. The woman he had dismissed as ordinary became extraordinary when her children's welfare was threatened. The suburban mother he had characterized as boring became everything he never expected: relentless, strategic, and absolutely committed to ensuring that his crimes had lasting consequences. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who has been underestimated for too long, and finally decides to show the world exactly what they're capable of accomplishing. 2 years after Mike's abandonment shattered what I thought was my secure suburban life, I stood in the conference room of Walsh & Associates, signing the final documents that would officially dissolve our marriage and establish permanent support arrangements for Lucas and Nathan. The woman reflected in the polished conference table's surface bore little resemblance to the anxious, self-doubting wife who had once accepted being called boring as an accurate assessment of her character. Jennifer Walsh shuffled through the settlement papers with the satisfied efficiency of someone who had achieved everything her client had hoped for and more. The final divorce decree included provisions that would ensure my children's security well into adulthood, guaranteed college funding, comprehensive health insurance, and monthly support payments that reflected Mike's true earning capacity rather than the diminished income he had initially claimed. Rebecca, I have to say this is one of the most complete reversals I've ever accomplished in a marital fraud case, Jennifer observed, reviewing the terms that would govern Mike's obligations for the next 13 years. Your ex-husband attempted to steal your family's financial future and escape accountability entirely. Instead, he's now legally bound to provide more support than he would have contributed if he had simply remained married and behaved responsibly. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mike's attempt to escape domestic responsibilities had resulted in far greater obligations than he would have faced as a committed husband and father. His pursuit of freedom from family burdens had created legal constraints that would follow him indefinitely, ensuring that his financial obligations to Lucas and Nathan could never again be abandoned on a whim. But the real transformation hadn't been in our legal status or financial arrangements, it had been in my understanding of who I was and what I was capable of achieving when properly motivated. The woman who had once internalized Mike's criticism as accurate self-assessment had discovered reserves of strength, intelligence, and determination that 16 years of marriage had kept dormant but not destroyed. My professional life had undergone the most dramatic evolution. 6 months after Mike's departure, I had parlayed my investigative skills and newfound confidence into a full-time position with Orlando's district attorney's office, working as a victim advocate, specializing in financial crimes and domestic fraud. The same methodical approach that had once been dismissed as boring suburban housekeeping had proven invaluable in helping other families navigate complex legal systems and recover from economic betrayal. Ms. Martinez, you've become one of our most effective advocates, District Attorney Patricia Rivera had told me during my recent performance review. Victims trust you because you've experienced what they're going through, but they also respect you because you clearly know how to fight back successfully. You've helped more families recover stolen assets in 2 years than most advocates accomplish in entire career. The position had connected me with dozens of other women whose stories echoed elements of my own experience, husbands who had systematically drained joint accounts, partners who had accumulated secret debt, spouses who had disappeared with savings intended for children's education or family emergency.
Each case reinforced my understanding that Mike's betrayal hadn't been unique or personal. It had been part of a pattern of behavior that relied on victims' shock, shame, and inexperience with legal systems to ensure successful escapes from accountability. Working with these families had also revealed the crucial importance of immediate, aggressive response to financial abandonment. The women who recovered most successfully were those who moved quickly to freeze assets, document crimes, and pursue legal remedies before their ex-partners could further dissipate marital resources. My own experience had taught me that emotional considerations about protecting the betrayer's reputation or maintaining family privacy were luxuries that victims couldn't afford when their children's welfare was at stake. Sophia, now 16 and thriving in her junior year of high school, had developed into a remarkable young woman whose analytical abilities and moral convictions continued to impress everyone who encountered her. Her experience investigating Mike's crimes had crystallized her interest in legal advocacy, and she was already taking college-level courses in criminal justice and constitutional law through a dual enrollment program at Valencia College. "Mom, I've been thinking about my college application essays," she mentioned one evening as we prepared dinner together in our familiar kitchen routine. "I want to write about how financial crime affects families not just economically but emotionally and psychologically. Most people don't understand that stealing from your spouse isn't just theft, it's a form of domestic violence that destroys trust and security in ways that take years to rebuild." Her insight reflected a maturity that had emerged from our shared crisis, but also a perspective that would serve her well in whatever career she ultimately chose. Sophia had learned firsthand that justice required active pursuit, that systems designed to protect victims only functioned when those victims understood how to access and utilize available resources. "I think I want to specialize in family law like Jennifer," she continued, "but focus specifically on cases where one parent tries to escape financial responsibility for their children. Kids deserve advocates who understand that child support isn't charity, it's a legal obligation that should be enforced regardless of how the paying parent feels about their former family." Lucas and Nathan, now 7 years old and flourishing in 2nd grade, had adapted to our reconfigured family structure with the resilience that children often display when their remaining parent provides consistent love and security. They occasionally mentioned their father, usually in the context of friends' stories about their own dads, but without the desperate longing that had characterized their questions immediately after his departure. Their relationship with Mike had evolved into something distant but civil, limited to monthly video calls that Mike maintained primarily to comply with court-ordered visitation requirements. The calls were stilted and awkward, conversations between a man who had chosen to become a stranger and children who had learned not to depend on his presence or promises. Daddy said he might visit us for Christmas, Nathan had mentioned after their most recent call, his tone carrying more curiosity than excitement. But I don't think he actually will. He always says maybe about things and then they don't happen. His matter-of-fact assessment demonstrated how thoroughly Mike had forfeited his children's trust and expectations. Lucas, always the more direct of the twins, had been even blunter in his evaluation. I think Daddy likes his new house more than he likes us, he had confided during bedtime stories one evening, but that's okay because we have Mommy and Sophia and Carol and that's enough family for me. His acceptance of Mike's absence wasn't bitter or angry. It was simply realistic recognition that some people weren't reliable sources of love or support. The house itself had been transformed from a monument to failed marriage into a celebration of our family's resilience and recovery. Mike's former home office had become a study space where Sophia worked on her advanced coursework and I prepared case files for the district attorney's office. The master bedroom had been redecorated in colors and styles that reflected my tastes rather than compromised decisions made to accommodate someone else's preferences. Most significantly, we had created new traditions and routines that belonged entirely to us. Saturday mornings were reserved for farmers' market visits, followed by elaborate family brunches where we planned weekend activities and discussed upcoming events. Sunday evenings featured movie nights where we took turns choosing films, creating a democracy of entertainment that would have been impossible when Mike's preferences always took precedent. I like our family better now, Sophia had observed during one of these Sunday sessions, speaking with the honesty that had characterized her perspective throughout our crisis. When Mike was here, everything had to revolve around his schedule and his moods and his opinion. Now we can make decisions based on what's actually good for our family instead of what keeps him happy. Her observation highlighted one of the most unexpected benefits of Mike's departure: the discovery that his presence had often created tension and constraint rather than stability and security. His need to control household decisions, his dismissive attitude toward activities he found uninteresting, and his general air of superiority had created an atmosphere where other family members' preferences were always secondary consideration. The financial settlement had provided security that extended far beyond immediate needs. The college funds that Mike had emptied were not only restored, but substantially enhanced, ensuring that all 3 children would have educational opportunities without the burden of student debt. The house was now owned free and clear, eliminating the mortgage payments that had once stretched our budget. Most importantly, Mike's court-ordered support payments were administered through the state's child support enforcement system, meaning that any attempt to reduce or eliminate his contributions would trigger immediate legal consequence. The best part about this arrangement, Jennifer had explained during our final legal consultation, is that Mike's obligations are now enforced by the state rather than by you personally. If he tries to reduce his payments or disappear again, he'll be dealing with government agencies that have far more resources and authority than any private citizen could wield. But the transformation that meant the most to me was internal and psychological. The woman who had once accepted being characterized as boring and predictable had discovered that these qualities, properly directed, were actually formidable strengths. My preference for careful planning had enabled me to build a comprehensive legal case against Mike's crime. My attention to detail had uncovered evidence that more impulsive investigators might have missed. My commitment to stability had motivated me to fight relentlessly for my children's security when a less determined parent might have accepted defeat. More fundamentally, I had learned to value my own judgment and priorities instead of viewing them through the lens of someone else's criticism. Mike's dismissal of my practical nature as boring had been a projection of his own inability to appreciate the intelligence required to manage complex family logistics successfully. His characterization of my preference for stability as small-minded thinking had reflected his failure to understand that choosing security for one's children was actually evidence of sophisticated long-term planning. The community that had supported us throughout our crisis had evolved into a network of relationships that enriched our lives in ways that Mike's presence had somehow prevented. Carol Jenkins remained our closest neighbor and friend, but she had been joined by colleagues from the district attorney's office, parents from the children's schools, and families I had met through my victim advocacy work. "Rebecca, you've become one of the most respected advocates in our community," Carol had mentioned during a recent conversation about local political issues. People know that when you take on a case, you'll pursue it with intelligence and determination until justice is achieved. That's exactly the kind of reputation that makes a real difference in people's lives. My advocacy work had connected me with other professionals who shared my commitment to protecting families from financial predators and domestic fraud. These relationships had opened opportunities for professional development and community involvement that had been impossible when my identity was primarily defined as Mike's wife and the mother of his children. The speaking engagements that had emerged from my successful case against Mike had become a regular part of my professional responsibility. Law enforcement agencies, legal organizations, and victim advocacy groups regularly invited me to discuss the investigation techniques and legal strategies that had enabled our family's recovery from financial abandonment. The key insight that transformed our situation, I would tell audiences of attorneys, social workers, and other advocates, was recognizing that immediate, aggressive legal action was necessary, regardless of emotional considerations about protecting the perpetrator's reputation or maintaining family privacy. Crimes require consequences, and delaying that accountability only gives the perpetrator more time to hide assets or escape jurisdiction. These presentations had connected me with hundreds of other families facing similar crises, creating a network of mutual support and shared expertise that benefited everyone involved. Women who had been victimized by financial fraud were eager to share information about effective legal strategies, while those who had successfully recovered stolen assets were motivated to help others navigate similar challenges. The personal growth that had emerged from our crisis extended beyond professional accomplishments to include interests and activities that had been dormant during my marriage. The photography hobby that Mike had dismissed as impractical had evolved into a serious artistic pursuit that provided both creative satisfaction and supplemental income. Weekend photography workshops and local art fairs had become regular family activities that the children enjoyed and that generated modest but meaningful revenue. "Mom, your pictures are getting really good," Sophia had observed while helping me prepare for a local gallery show. "I think you're actually a lot more creative than you gave yourself credit for when you were married to Mike." Maybe being called boring was more about his limited imagination than your actual capability. Her insight captured something essential about the person I had become versus the person I had been during my marriage. Mike's constant criticism and dismissive comments had created a version of myself that was constrained and self-doubting, always seeking approval rather than pursuing authentic interests and ambition. His departure had removed those constraints, allowing aspects of my personality that had been suppressed to emerge and flourish. The romantic prospects that had begun appearing in my life represented another dimension of the transformation that Mike's abandonment had triggered. The confident, accomplished woman I had become attracted very different attention than the anxious, approval-seeking wife I had once been. Men who appreciated intelligence, independence, and determination were drawn to qualities that Mike had consistently undermined and devalued. "Rebecca, you've become an entirely different person since your divorce," observed David Chen, a fellow advocate from the district attorney's office who had become an increasingly frequent presence in our family's social activity. "Not different in the sense that you've changed your fundamental character, but different in that you're finally expressing who you actually are instead of who someone else expected you to be." His perspective reflected observations from multiple friends and colleagues who had witnessed my evolution from defensive suburban wife to confident professional advocate. The transformation hadn't involved becoming someone new. It had involved removing the layers of compromise and accommodation that had concealed my authentic personality during years of trying to satisfy someone who was ultimately incapable of appreciation or satisfaction. The most profound validation had come through my children's assessment of our family's journey from crisis to stability. Lucas and Nathan, despite their young age, understood that their current security and happiness were the result of their mother's determination to fight for their rights when their father chose to abandon his responsibilities. "Mommy, are you glad Daddy went away?" Nathan had asked during one of our bedtime conversations, his question carrying the directness that 7-year-olds often bring to complex adult situations. "I'm not glad that he hurt our family," I had replied carefully, "but I'm proud of how strong we became when we had to take care of ourselves." Sometimes difficult things happen that help us discover we're braver and smarter than we thought we were. Lucas had nodded seriously, processing this explanation with characteristic thoughtfulness. I think we're a better family now because we know we can fix problems together instead of needing someone else to fix them for us. His assessment captured the essence of what our crisis had revealed about our family's capabilities and resilience. Mike's presence had created an illusion of security that was actually dependency on someone whose commitment was conditional and unreliable. His departure had forced us to develop genuine strength and self-sufficiency that no external circumstances could threaten or destroy. As I reflected on the 2-year journey from devastating abandonment to comprehensive recovery, the most striking realization was how thoroughly Mike had misjudged both my character and the likely consequences of his betrayal. The boring suburban wife he had dismissed and abandoned had proven to be a formidable adversary when properly motivated. Someone whose supposed predictability masked strategic intelligence and whose preference for stability reflected unshakable determination to protect her children's welfare. His escape to North Carolina with Amanda had provided temporary freedom from domestic responsibilities, but it had also created legal obligations that would follow him for the rest of his working life. The exciting new relationship he had prioritized over his family had ultimately cost him far more in financial obligations than remaining married would ever have required. The mountain retreat that was supposed to represent his liberation from boring suburban existence had been sold to pay restitution for his crimes, leaving him with debt obligations and legal constraints that made his current life far more restricted than the one he had abandoned. Most ironically, his pursuit of adventure and spontaneity had resulted in court-ordered schedules and supervised interactions that eliminated any possibility of the freedom he had claimed to seek. The most satisfying aspect of your case, Jennifer had observed during our final legal consultation, is that your ex-husband got exactly the opposite of what he was trying to achieve. He wanted to escape responsibility and gained far greater obligation. He wanted excitement and adventure but created legal constraints that will limit his choices for decades. He thought he was dealing with someone who would accept injustice passively, but instead he encountered someone who pursued accountability relentlessly. The boring wife he had underestimated had become everything he never expected: strategic, relentless, legally sophisticated, and absolutely committed to ensuring that his crimes had lasting consequences. The woman he had characterized as ordinary had proven to be extraordinary when her children's future was threatened, demonstrating strengths and capabilities that his constant criticism had concealed but never actually eliminated. Today, when people ask me about that transformative period in my life, I tell them that being abandoned by someone who found me boring was ultimately a gift that revealed my authentic self and capability. Mike's betrayal had forced me to discover that my values and priorities were actually sources of strength, rather than limitations, that my commitment to family and stability reflected wisdom rather than narrow thinking. The suburban mother he had dismissed as predictable had become unpredictable in exactly the ways that mattered most: impossible to intimidate, impossible to deceive, and absolutely impossible to defeat when fighting for her children's rights and security. The boring wife had become everything he never expected, and everything our family had always needed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.